Hey everybody, it's John Kraska with Every Library and the Every Library Institute. It has been Books Week 2025. We're midweek, midweek. There's been a lot of good conversations that I've been having with authors and editors and narrators of audiobooks and the publishing industry in general. My colleagues from Gigi Howard from Drinks in the Library, Lee Wind from the IBPA, Andrew Albanese, Rex Ogle. We're having some great chats either already this week, where you can watch them on demand on Facebook and on YouTube, Every Library, or coming up, where you should mark your calendars. We're having these conversations during Banned Books Week for two reasons, and it's interesting today that we've got a little bit of a microcosm of this. Some authors get deplatformed and banned. There's no justice in that. Some authors are pushed off because of what they're talking about and who they're talking about. Other authors are looking to have their voice heard, sometimes for the first time. And at Banned Books Week, it's a time that we need to be having a big conversation about reading. What's the power of reading? The power of the word, the power of storytelling. And so it's a real pleasure for me today to bring in two people who are top-notch storytellers. I said to them in the green room that I was going to do them one at a time. I'm doing both at the same time. Ellen Marie Wiseman and Markus Redmond. Thank you for being here today. You're both here today in order to have a chat about the work that you do as authors, the reasons that you write, but also some of the big ideas that are going on in America right now. So let me do the bios if I could. I always want to do the official bio. So Ellen Marie Wiseman, New York Times and USA Today bestselling author, known for her compassion, authenticity, and depth with which her novels explore real historical injustice. Born and raised in 3 Mile Bay in New York, she's a first-generation German-American who discovered her love of reading and writing while attending first grade in one of the last one-room schoolhouses in New York State. Since then, her novels have been published worldwide, translated into 20 languages, and sold more than 1 million copies in the U.S. alone. Mother of two, Ellen lives on the shores of Lake Ontario with her husband and her dog. Ellen, thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you for having me.
It's a treat. And Markus Redmond is an actor, director, screenwriter, and author, known for his roles on Doogie Howser, MD, NYPD Blue, Murder One, Mad About You, Angel, and Fight Club. He wrote and starred alongside Whoopi Goldberg and Sharon Stone in the indie film If I Had Known I Was a Genius. He wrote, directed, and starred in the Amazon Prime thriller The Sixth Degree, and has multiple screenplays in development. He lives in Los Angeles, and Blood Slaves is his first novel. Markus, thanks for taking the time.
My pleasure.
Thank you. So I want to start off, Ellen, if I could, with you.
Sure.
And talk about The Lies They Told, because we have a, not speculative fiction here, but historical fiction around the 1930s eugenics movement. And I don't know how much of that history was well known to you before you started it. I want to find out from you a little bit what drew you to it and why The Lies They Told was an important story for you to tell.
Sure. Excuse me. I first learned about the American eugenics movement when I was researching my first book, The Plum Tree, which is a World War II novel, and it's loosely based on my mother's experiences growing up in Germany during World War II. That's when I first learned that the United States was the leader in the eugenics movement and the first country in the world to implement forced sterilization programs, and that the Nazis had taken a lot of their theories and policies from American eugenicists. As a matter of fact, California's sterilization program was so successful that the Nazis asked them for advice. And when a top American eugenicist wrote a book called The Passing of the Great Race, Hitler wrote him a fan letter and said, "This book is my Bible." So then, as I was writing two of my other books, What She Left Behind and The Lost Girls of Willowbrook, which are about insane asylums and institutions for the disabled, I kept running into these threads about eugenics. And I decided that I wanted to write about the American eugenics movement, which was, had a huge influence on American society. It facilitated a lot of laws and things like that. I didn't realize what a big, huge, dark, tangled web it was. So it was quite a thing to try to narrow it down.
It's interesting to me, and if I can bring in you here, Marcus, the hearing about how the Nazis watched the American eugenics movement. I know that the Nazis also looked at Jim Crow and the history of the American Reconstruction period in terms of the apartheid state. I mean, you're writing a very different kind of novel here. It's a vampire myth within the history of slavery. And can you take us through a little bit about blood slaves, though?
So, Blood Slaves essentially is about a slave in 1710 who discovers that vampires aren't from Europe, they're from Africa. So he meets the last one, he takes the blood, he builds a vampire army, he takes revenge against the slave owner, he takes the plantation for himself and his people, and he ends slavery 150 years before the Civil War. That's it in a nutshell. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff in between all of
right.
that.
So you could have written a supernatural horror story. You could have written a liberation story, but you put those two together. How do you balance those elements?
I didn't intend to. I had set out to write a vampire story just because I think vampires are cool. And then it was 2020, and I saw, like everyone else did, the murder of George Floyd on television. And that shifted everything because I was very upset about it. And I was speaking to my wife about it, and she knew that I was working on a vampire book. And she said, "It's too bad your vampires can't go back in time and fix everything." And that is what became the birth of the idea of Blood Slaves, to actually go back in time, have vampires rise, African vampires, and have them actually change the course of history. So in that sense, it was fairly easy to balance the two because I was going in with a very specific purpose. I think we sort of get used to vampires being very broody and in long leather coats and being very in love with young women and drinking blood out of goblets. None of that happens in this. This was an entirely new origin story for what a vampire was, and the power was used for a very specific purpose.
Yeah, the kind of emo goth, shoegazing vampire is certainly not what you've been writing.
No, not these guys.
The idea of taking that historical wrong and trying to right it, correct it, as in writing it. Ellen, when you're coming around to the eugenics movement in The Lies That They Told and your other works as well, the research that has to go into it, because you owe a fidelity to the historic record, but then making the characters in the narrative that tells not a polemic but a perspective on this. Can you share a little bit about the through line of The Lies They Told?
Yeah, sure. Normally when I first start being interested in a topic, I kind of research it a little bit further to see if I could actually make a story out of it. And I kind of have to stick to my brand, and all of my books feature strong young women. And so I kind of have to see how I would make that affect my main character. So for The Lies They Told, the eugenics movement, like I said before, it affected so many things in America and in society. But I chose to start the story off with a young immigrant coming to America, looking for a better life for herself and her 2-year-old daughter. Because, in the beginning of the United States, immigrants were welcomed and they were encouraged to come here to settle the land. And about the mid 20th century, Americans started to fear immigrants. And this is where the eugenics stepped in. They came up with stricter inspections. They came up with crazy IQ tests, asking immigrants if is it better to sweep a staircase from the top to the bottom or the bottom to the top. things like that. And they, the eugenicists were so powerful. They, influenced stricter immigration laws. And then, when my main character gets to the Blue Ridge Mountains, she thinks that she's safe until she realizes that the children who are going to be under her care have been ordered to, or taught to, hide from the sheriff when he comes around. And the reason that they're taught to hide is because despite the fact that these people are US citizens, they're facing many of the same threats that my main characters faced on Ellis Island. They're being labeled feeble-minded, they're being labeled promiscuous, they're being labeled ignorant. And even though those kinds of things were happening all over the country to families that were deemed socially inadequate, I chose to put it in, use the Blue Ridge Mountain families as a clear example of the way that eugenics was used against United States citizens, because the government of Virginia was doing this to take the land to form the Shenandoah National Park. They sent a photographer up there. They had the children, pose by these broken down houses and put dirt on their face. And, for instance, one family that was photographed, the next day, 12 of the children from the family were taken and institutionalized and sterilized. And like I said, these raids happened all over the country during eugenics movement. If a family was deemed unfit, their children could be taken, the parents could be institutionalized, the children could be redistributed to be raised in a more appropriate home of an elite family, or institutionalized and sterilized. So, I had to kind of pick all the things in there that would affect my main character, but I also found ways to work in some of the other things that were happening, having some of the other characters talk about it and stuff. So it was pretty tough to do.
The topic is tough. The history is true, and also it makes people uncomfortable. Both
Yeah.
of you were writing about eras of America where the majority population there's incentives for the majority population to oppress the minority population, or to push forward a view of what America should look like, or how America should behave. Ellen, I was surprised in the green room before we started talking today to hear your story. This is set partially on Ellis Island, the embarkation point for your characters, and hearing that you've recently been disinvited from speaking at Ellis Island. Yeah, do you mind telling this story to our watchers?
No, not at all. The Ellis Island, Save the Ellis Island, had invited me to come and do a presentation and signing on Ellis Island. And, my publicist got it all set up. Everybody was all set and all excited. They were even starting to promote it. And then about 2 weeks before the date that it was supposed to happen, my publicist got a call or email saying that they canceled the event. And she tried to get an answer to why. She knew that they had asked for 2 books so that they could be read ahead of time. But the only answer she got was that there was a new director of the U.S. Interior and a new director of Ellis Island. And so I think once they realized what the subject of my book was, that they said, no, we don't want her talking about that.
So, and forgive me, I just want to make sure that the folks understand we're middle of Band Books Week. It's early October 2025. This just happened a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, in August.
Yeah. So the interesting thing that was happening around that same time was the stories that were coming to light about how the National Park Service, which is part of the Interior Department, was removing certain materials about certain topics from the bookstores at national parks and national historic sites. And the idea that if you're going to go to a place like Wounded Knee and they're going to be taking the materials out around Native American history, that we're in a different world right now than we were just a couple of years ago.
Yes.
Yeah. Ellen, I'm sorry that was one of the experiences that you had there.
Thanks.
So the conversations that you're both hoping to spark amongst your readers, the thinking that you want to do. Markus, it's an alternative history, and it's a fantastic reality, of course, with the vampires and such. But that story of liberation, and gosh, what would it mean? What would it mean to shift that timeline back 150 years? You know, the conversations that should be sparked from that. I hope you're hearing from readers about those conversations.
I have. I think a lot of folks have been having a difficult time getting through the book, especially the first half of the book. And there are people who believe that it is excessive in the first half, that it is pure just trauma porn, I've heard. And, listen, every reader is, allowed their own experience with whatever book. But I think the problem is that it's a little too close to truth. It's a little too close to home. The things in the book that I describe are things that happened to people on this land.
The system,
and that's a very difficult thing for a lot of folks. I mean, we get a lot of World War II stories, because America's the hero. America was not the hero during slavery. And I think that becomes a big part of the problem. So I think that discussion becomes about the lingering effects of enslavement, how systems were put in place hundreds of years ago that are still affecting folks now, and how you survive that, how you find your own inner power to survive that and figure out a way to thrive in it. And that's the metaphor of the Remungans, is that they symbolize inner power, inner strength.
Well, chattel slavery is a brutal system of control, and to suggest that there's something sensationalistic about what you're writing, I'm glad you're pushing back here about that, because the resistance that a system of control environment like that, the number of slave revolts that happened were true. The number of folks who had even small acts of resistance, to slow down the mechanisms that they were involved in. And yet, what you're speculating here with this kind of historical fiction framework is one that would be very, it would make Haiti as a slave revolt, look very small. So, the act of resistance that you're describing here was a true story.
Right. Yeah, and listen, Clay Kane, who is another author and a journalist and incredibly wise, he says, remembering is resistance. And we are living in a time where they don't want us to remember. They want to change the outcome. They want to change how things were presented. They want to change what history actually was. And so I think it's important for us to remember what happened, how it happened, who did this, especially in a time where, we are just, walking into another era of violence in this country right now. And the lines are being drawn politically and racially. So, we can't afford to forget what happened.
I agree with you. And I'd like to ask our colleague Ellen here a question about that too, and come back to you with the same kind of question. Censorship and book bans, they target stories about minority populations in many different ways. And most censorship efforts are campaigns of erasure. The books about slavery and race, the books about the disability community that are targeted. How do you view, Ellen, your work in this climate? Because you are talking about essentially a brutal system of control as well.
Yeah, I've written about child labor in the United States. I've written about insane asylums in the United States. I've written about Now I can't even remember. A lot of injustices that happened in America. And I feel like even what I was taught in school in the 70s and stuff was already whitewashed. You know what I mean? It was already, they weren't already telling us everything. And I love to uncover those things that we weren't taught about in school and let people know about them. I hear from readers all the time. I've never heard about eugenics. I didn't know about, well, just a lot of the different subjects that I've written about. And I think that it's important, it's getting worse now. It's getting worse. They want to erase even more now. And I think it's really important for us to learn about these things that happened and also understand and recognize that these old ideas are resurfacing in new forms. I can see the tie between what's happening now and eugenics, like clear as a bell. It's just coming in new forms, so I think it's really important for us to try to keep fighting back and talking about this stuff.
And in the same vein, the so-called anti-CRT movement, the so-called, we're too woke. This reframing is a. I liked the Brown versus Board of Education ruling by the Supreme Court back in 1954. It's been 70 years where there might be a little bit of an arc of history. And I'm not interested in seeing situations where books are being erased from libraries because of who they talk about and who writes them. I'm not interested in seeing a situation where museums are whitewashing, diminishing the storytelling that's done, or archives are disappearing. This is not the kind of an arc of history that I want to see. And I think in this climate, historical fiction and speculative fiction, I think there's a role, really, Marcus, here for horror, too. I think there's some truth-telling. I'm not a very comfortable horror reader, personally. And that's my question isn't intended.
I am.
Are you? Great. Then let's talk about it, because how do you wake people up if you're not being honest?
I don't know, honestly. Listen, I personally feel as though horror is a lot like punk music. You listen to a lot of punk, and punk almost always has something to say. And those who do not want that being told will just say, oh, it's just loud and abrasive and nonsense. And I think horror is a great entry point to getting people to sort of like examine a circumstance or a situation or a period in time or an injustice, because it's front-loaded entertainment horror. You kind of know what you're gonna get, and hopefully what happens is you get involved in that, and then through the characters in the story, you actually realize what the injustice was, how it was played out, how it mirrors what's happening in real time. And you start thinking, which is why I think it's wildly important to have all of the conversations, especially when it comes to my book, those that don't like it and those that do like it, because I think both have merit, because I think both are investigating the same thing, the uncomfortableness of these horrific things that happen to people. And what do we do about it? We know what happens in the book, but what do we do now?
What do we do now? Exactly. Ellen, you said that you're more comfortable than I am, but as a reader of horror, but also the horrors that are in that historic record.
Right. Yeah. I was always a big fan of Stephen King and Anne Rice and all that. And I always thought that would be my genre if I started writing. But I realized that I am writing about monsters. I am writing about horror that humans did to each other. And it's like, I didn't mention this before, but my book, The Lost Girls of Willowbrook, was about Willowbrook on Staten Island that Geraldo Rivera did the expose on in the 70s.
Yes.
And some people read that and think, oh, she's being too graphic, and she's being, we don't need to read all this horrible stuff that happened to these children in this institution, these children that ended up staying there their whole lives and became adults. But I actually toned it down. I did a lot of research on that place, and I read the history and sociology of Willowbrook State School, and one of the doctors that worked there that was really instrumental in closing the place down. And I actually did some events with him, and he told some stories that were much more horrific than anything that I wrote about. And a lot of people loved the book too, and they're glad to have the eyes open. And a lot of people, even I live in New York State, and people didn't even know about Willowbrook, So yeah, there's real monsters walking around,
It's interesting. Your publishing house, you both are published with Kensington, and what you just said, Ellen, in reference to what Marcus said earlier about the first half of the book is a hard book. That the story that has to be told is because of the truth of the matter. I was prepping myself for this interview today, and I now understand why Kensington put you both on the same panel, because there's a resonant there's a resonant point there that I think is really fascinating. I appreciate you both sharing with me about it today and about your work. It is Banned Books Week, and there's some first-person singular issues with being banned and deplatforming this conversation, but it's also every library. And I got to close with just a real quick check-in about libraries. I do this with everybody. I got special on this one. Just to do a check-in about libraries, because I know writers read. I don't know writers who don't read. And I'm wondering what libraries have been. Ellen knew you as a researcher, and Marcus as a researcher, but you as readers. Wondering if you got any sing for your supper stories from me today.
Well, I went to a really, really tiny high school, and there was 28 people in my graduating class, I think. And so we had a really, really tiny library, but I loved it when we had study hall in the library, because then you could just grab a book instead of doing your work.
There you go.
And as I've since I've been published, libraries have been my greatest. I've got 6 events at libraries this week, and they have been my greatest supporters. And I always have way more people show up at libraries to hear me talk than even bookstores. But I think that I think it's great that libraries can make all of these stories and accessible to everyone, and hopefully protect some of the voices that are trying to be shut down.
Yeah, I appreciate that very much. So, Marcus, you want to take us home?
Yeah, I've had an amazing response from libraries ever since Blood Slaves came out, even before it came out. I mean, this is my first rodeo. It's been fantastic. I think what's really cool about libraries to me is that it's a free pass to explore, right? So, you like certain books, you like certain genres, and you're going to buy those, you're going to investigate those. But a library, you get to just sort of walk around, and if something sparks your interest that you wouldn't necessarily be looking for, you can just check it out. You can just explore it. The idea of being able to explore things that you wouldn't necessarily do on your own or think about on your own, but the fact that you can walk into this building and something can catch your eye that you know nothing about, and you can pull that book off of a shelf and you can find out everything about it. To me, that's what the magic of a library is, because that's where growth comes from. That's how you learn things. That's how you expand your mind, expand your life, expand your views. It's like right there. It's like readily available, which is kind of amazing.
It is. Somebody else this week or earlier this week said to me, could you imagine trying to set up a library these days? The whole concept of libraries. First off, who'd want to pay for it? So
yeah.
Markus Redmond, author of Blood Slaves, thank you very much for being with us today. Ellen Marie Wiseman, author of The Lies They Told, I appreciate you both very much for joining me during Banned Books Week on Every Library Live.
Thank you for having us.
For sure. So what we always do is we wave at the camera while I put up the title card, and we talk to each other in the green room. So thank you.
Oh, thanks.